you give people a sense of your background?
Hi, Layman. It's a pleasure to be here on the Integral stage. My name is Ēlen Awalom, and I am an embodied leadership trainer. And later on, we'll maybe talk about that a little bit more. And I am the founder of a budding startup called the Embodied Leadership Institute. And I work in training organizations and individuals, organizations, particularly startups and businesses and corporations, engaging in important developmental work, both through communication training and somatic work to help create healthier work environments and also improve or reach various measurements along the way. But the realization that both can coexist and supporting people in doing the work to achieve that. And I'm based in Washington, D.C. My background is that I was raised by African leftist parents. I was born in Sudan in the mid 80s, early to mid 80s, depending on how you think of it. I was born in Khartoum, Khartoum Bahri, which is the capital of Sudan, which is currently, unfortunately, in the midst of a really severe war. And my parents are from Eritrea, but I came to the US when I was a year old. And I grew up in New York City and right outside of the nation's capital, about 15 minutes outside of the United States nation's capital. I just remember that you're Canadian. Don't mind my US centricity. And and I and I live in Washington, D.C., and I have been on my spiritual path for a very long time. But for many years, including in my household that I grew up in and the environments that I grew up in big cities like New York and right outside of Washington, I was really steeped in, you know, intersectional feminist thinking, as well as Marxist ideology, Marxist and leftist, not always Marxist, but hardcore leftist ideology. And I became pretty heavily politically involved by the time I entered college at 18 in Williamsburg, Virginia, and kind of deepened my path along the way until at age 24, I had a massive, spontaneous 3-day experience of non dual consciousness. And suddenly it was like, why am I even still here? I was like, I don't understand what's the point of being here. Like I'm awakened. and and so it was wobbly for about 6 years. I was kind of trying to piece it together because I was like, well, it seems like I don't know, I wouldn't have used the word enlightened, but it seems like I have I understand these massive spiritual truths, but there are a lot of things in life that are still really hard for me and I don't get it, right? And I can manifest things, but again, I'm still having a lot of difficulty. So I spent years, months and months and years in deep states of meditation, and searching and trying to figure it all out. And by the time I was 30, I was like, man, everything is really hard. And it doesn't make sense because based on all of these mystical teachings and new age literature that I'm reading, like things should be wonderful. And yet I'm struggling in all of these ways. I'm having challenges. And so that led me to psychotherapy. And for better or for worse, that's when the true possibility of embodying non-dual consciousness emerged for me. And as I did that work, I started to realize and be able to manage more duality, like be both in both states of consciousness. And later on, I went to a beautiful retreat at Esalen in Big Sur, California, and nothing has ever been the same. That was 5 years ago. And thus began a really deep journey of plant medicine, somatic work, reading Wilbur, reading spiral dynamics, finding the liminal web, and slowly feeling like some pieces of the puzzle have come together. But still a lot of searching, a lot of healing, a lot of growing, a lot of learning. And I feel that while I definitely do not think that I'm enlightened the way that I did on that day when I was 24, I do feel strongly that not just me, but our community has a lot to offer to people who are ready and willing to hear what we have to share, the gifts that we come bearing. So that's my introduction.
Thanks. It's a pleasure to have you here, and it's a pleasure
Yeah,
to have someone who can speak so openly about altered state experience and shadow work and development altogether. Now, I
yeah,
know you, and we were talking about this a little bit before we put the cameras on. You've been thinking a lot about how a second tier of development relates to the appreciation, but also the transcendence of the identity of victimhood. Is that right?
that's correct.
And what's
Yeah,
alive
so
for you around that?
yeah, so I would say that, and this is going to be a little controversial, but like I said, I've reached a stage where I've decided to really just speak what's true and to no longer kind of repress my voice. Part of my healing, my specific journey, is unlocking my throat chakra and really just trusting that I can speak my truth and that all will still be well. And that's, you know, also part of forming a more secure attachment style. So I spent quite a bit of time in Silicon Valley and in San Francisco, and I kind of arrived to the scene at a point when there was a lot of pushback from people who were more social justice oriented about the things in the industry that were desperately in need of acknowledgement, right? So, for instance, many people, many engineers, software engineers, and such have experienced neurodivergence, whether it's autism or ADHD, many different conditions. And yet, the circumstances at a lot of large tech companies are not at all suitable for people who experience neurodivergence. So that was one layer, was like disability activism. Another layer was around like gender and basically intersectionality. So I came at a point where this space that was very, to use integral language, orange, was suddenly getting tremendous pushback from people who were what I would consider to be at, in some ways, at a green level of thinking. But what happened, the deeper that I went into those spaces, is that I started to realize, oh boy, we are really in a mess. And the problem is not necessarily about the gender or the ethnicity or class background or even the neurodivergence or non-neurodivergence of who is in charge. This is a developmental issue. And that doesn't mean that people who maybe come from a working class background might not have really important insights that someone who grew up, in a really wealthy household might not have. But what it did mean was that if people had not done their shadow work and their trauma integration work, those other things were not going to resolve the multiple issues that we were facing, both in the industry and, of course, the tech industry in particular has a major impact on the entire globe. And that was when I was like, so what now? Right? Okay, so like the cool young white guys don't necessarily have the answers. They have some skills, some important skills, but they don't necessarily have the answer. But also, like these women of color, whom come from developing countries, they also have like really intense trauma and shadow that makes it often not healthy to be in there, to be working with them. And I won't. There was a very high profile case of someone. Actually, I'll just say of a woman who was the leader, the founder of an organization called Black Girls Code, who was ousted from her organization because for more than 10 years, her most of her employees were other Black women, but she had been engaging in lots of emotional and psychological aggression and all kinds of other behavior that was really, really harmful. So I like I said, I was watching this, and this was like over a period of a decade, and I was becoming very disheartened. But as I pulled back, uh, I realized one, that I needed to focus on myself, so that I could be regulated enough to engage with a variety of people, regardless of where they were at in terms of from my perspective, developmentally speaking. And that two, I needed to figure out what I really felt was the way forward. And hence, and then enter, at a time when I was really asking that question, enter Ēlen and enter Wilbur's work. So only very recently, over the last 6 months, have I begun speaking about what I consider to be, post-feminist, post-capitalist, post-blackness, all of these different perspectives. Because, as I mentioned, our world, but particularly Gen Z and millennials, in my experience, especially in large urban cities, are very heavily polarized in terms of thinking of the world through a green perspective, what I consider to be a green perspective. And so part of what I have been incubating and I'm articulating today is that my opinion is that if we want to support people in growing, or if we want to support human beings in creating a world that is healthier for all of us, providing the tools to engage in shadow work to everyone, regardless of their class background, regardless of where they are in the world, I believe is a big part of the way forward. So, for instance, when I was growing up in DC, education. So there are a lot of NGOs and think tanks and things like that here, and they have a heavy focus on, okay, we just need to go to developing countries and give them the tools that they need. Like, we need to build schools and we need to make sure that they have clean water. And those things are all really, really important. But oftentimes, I remember I would, when I was like taking international studies courses in college, I would learn about the corruption of the different NGOs. And I would be like, what is the problem? Like, why do human beings do this? Like, why is it that even when we have good intentions, there's still misuse of funds and there's all kinds of harm that occurs? And so what I'm essentially saying is that all the things from the stages before matter too, clean drinking water and high quality education, all of those things matter. But if we don't have leaders and just a world where people are supported, have the means, the circumstances to do this kind of developmental work, then I don't think I don't think that there is much hope, essentially.
It's fascinating to me the way that um, a developmental trajectory involves some exercises that are building you up and refining you, and you're practicing metacognitive capacity to modify your attention and see bigger scopes. But you
Yeah.
can only go up as far as you're free from what might be holding you back. And there's all kinds of things that are injuring us or weighing us down or hidden in the rest of our unit. And that element of shadow work, of freeing up the things that are inhibiting our spontaneous movement forward, is so universally applicable, right? It's not everybody wants to put the time into developing a level or mastering meditation or anything like that. That might only be
Right.
for a small number of people that feel drawn to it. But absolutely everybody needs support, needs healing, needs emotional maturation, needs shadow work. It's as important for the people who are doing cognitive and spiritual development as it is for the general population, and vice versa. And like in your example of the NGOs, it's as important for the people who are trying to help as it is for the people who we think need help. So I appreciate how universal that aspect of the project is.
Yeah, yeah. And I'll also share, um, at the height of the pandemic, so this is going to be in late 2021, a war broke out in my native, well, not in Eritrea, but uh, along the border between Eritrea and Ethiopia, a region called Tigray. And at the time, I had been removed from that my community. I guess I don't really consider them my community, but in terms of my ancestral community. And I had been removed from that for well over a decade. And somehow, I think I was on Clubhouse where I found like integral spaces and I was having a wonderful time there, but I somehow landed in those rooms and I was blown away because in my time away from the community, I had done so much work. Like I said, spiritual, developmental, um, physical, all kinds of healing. And I had forgotten about like the really intense red streak energy that flows through that community, through my ancestral community. And I spent hundreds of hours listening to conversations from people who were activists, both here and in Northeast Africa. And what became apparent to me as I listened with my new ears was, oh my God, this is a developmental issue. It does not really have anything to do with ethnicity. And yes, on the surface, it looks like they're fighting over economic resources and access to water. But there was just tremendous animosity towards all of the time. It was just like constant, like really intense bickering and fighting and aggression. And I understand like that region of the world for over a century has experienced nonstop war, like war after war after war, very brief periods of peace. And so I deeply empathize. But one, I realized, oh my God, I can't be here. Like I cannot be here because if I didn't return the aggression, then they would just, steamroll. Like they would just walk right over me. Uh, and so one that I wanted to build more capacity in my own nervous system so that I could be present with that kind of energy. And then two, that what I wanted to do was support people, particularly activists in the West, whether they supported the Eritrean government or were opposed to the Eritrean government, like wherever they fell along the spectrum in doing this trauma integration work. Because the traditional approach would be like the United Nations had a lot of they attempted to intervene. The United States was intervening, but as time went on, I mean, there were I want to say at least tens of thousands of people from Tigray and northern Ethiopia who were killed, and millions of people fled northern Ethiopia 2 years ago. So it was really, really dark. And while the war eventually did end, it wasn't without a tremendous amount of carnage and destruction, and even like beautiful ancient sacred sites that were important for people from both countries, like beautiful Orthodox Christian ancient churches and all of these things that were part of the heritage of both Eritreans and Ethiopians were destroyed because the level of antipathy was so tremendous. And so over and over again, I've come back to the realization that, hey, I really need to tend to myself. I really, really need to tend to myself because I will not be able to meet the world and meet the really important challenges, both that I experience and that we're collectively experiencing if I'm not regulated myself. And then two, I really want to keep learning and practicing these tools so that I can support as many people as possible.
It disturbs me emotionally a great deal when I hear about holy sites and ancient structures and churches and things being ruined. There's a special horror in desecrating the lineage of wisdom that our ancestors achieved and tried to pass down to us. One thing you've mentioned a couple of times is aggression. And there's obviously a lot of problems with aggression operating at a level that's too low, or coming out of trauma, or perversely operating in hierarchies and things like that. But what do you think is the healthy integrated role of aggression? What does aggression look like at higher levels?
Yeah, I love that question because I've been grappling with it. And I believe that we touched on it. I had a series that's posted on my Facebook page called Grounded Spirituality and Embodied Communication. And this brilliant facilitator named Laura Tatar, she's based in Copenhagen, but she's originally from Chicago and she's also of Israeli ancestry. We did some shadow work around my issues with aggression, and that was really fun. So I've been sitting with this over the last 2 weeks because I think that in those, for instance, when I was in those spaces, it actually would have been important for me to channel healthy aggression, aggression that I knew was not coming from a desire to harm them, but from a desire to be like, am I allowed to curse?
Yeah, go ahead.
Like, yo, what the fuck? Sisters, can you guys stop fucking fighting? Like, this is ridiculous. Like, and then I would actually command a level of respect, but it would be coming from a deeply embodied and compassionate place. But instead, the way that I showed up in that space was what they were perceiving, the mixed energy that I had. And they were like, we don't trust you. We think you're the police. We think you're the CIA. Oh, like, are you like being a drug mule in Mexico? I was in Mexico at the time, like all kinds of accusations. And now I recognize it's because they could feel my mixed frequency. They could feel my fear. They could feel my anxiety. And what love would have had me do was to kind of cut through the BS and kind of be a little bit more firm. And I understand that for me, part of it was that in my somatic training, we learned a lot about shame and dissociation. And we learned about being very, very careful with aggression, not engaging in aggression unless it's absolutely necessary, because it causes all kinds of things to happen in the nervous systems of people around us, right? And that we don't want to, like, there's psychopathic aggression, which does not consider the impact that our words and our energy have on others. But there's healthy aggression as well. And I am at this moment since my father passed away almost 3 months ago. Actually, it's today the 15th. Yes, my father passed away exactly 3 months ago today. And what I've been realizing about myself is there's a way in which I consider healthy aggression to be, I associate it with the sacred masculine. And there's a way in which I had been outsourcing that to my father, even though he had not been present in my life really as a father for a long time. And how this next stage of my life is about integrating, embodying the sacred masculine and integrating that healthy aggression and learning how and when to use that as a force for good and make sure that it's not coming from a place of shadow or a desire to hurt others. So I love that question. Thank you.
One of the things I think of when I think of aggression is the ability to exert force against a barrier, right? If you had to
Yeah,
kick a door open or something like that. And when it comes to the question of opening up our voice and finding our voice and opening up the throat chakra, which in my experience is something a lot of women struggle with and pay attention to in themselves. It seems like there's a role for aggression there of a certain mild kind, but you have to open that door up and you have to take a risk and you have to be willing to be a challenger in a certain way in order to have your voice open.
absolutely. And what comes up for me is I think it's also about discernment, uh, meaning that if we find ourselves in spaces where, so for instance, like if we have a platonic, friendship where the person regularly engages in kind of domineering or aggressive energy, My opinion is that it is important to unlock our throat chakra and kind of like be stern and boundaried, but that usually the best thing to do is to walk away, to let the person know, not to just walk away, but to say, hey, this is not working for me, and to walk away. So I don't think, versus, like I said, when it's necessary to utilize that voice and that force really, in order to bring more positive change in the world, or what I consider to be positive change in the world. So that's the discernment, because I think if it's a circumstance where we might experience harm, or we might get entangled with something that's not what I would consider aligned with our higher good, then I think it's important to walk away. But if it's a circumstance where channeling that energy will actually bring healing, then I think it can be very productive.
I'm imagining a something like a developmental stack of voice capacity, and at the lower levels we're a bit more like animals, and we bark and we growl and we bite, and we don't really pay attention to whether that's going to have terrible effects or not. And then a slightly more sophisticated level, we understand there are reasons to not always communicate. And sometimes we do that sort of automatically out of trauma or out of fear. Other times we do it wisely out of understanding there isn't a good result of speaking in this circumstance. But I'm also interested in higher possibilities of the voice. Sometimes we say of a singer or a writer or someone that they really found their voice. So it's more than
Yeah.
just the willingness to communicate, it's the discovery of a style in the way that you communicate more broadly in culture.
So thank you for saying that. About a month ago, almost a month ago, a beautiful, beautiful Portuguese singer of Cape Verdean ancestry named Sara Tavares passed away. And both the people of Cabo Verde and the people of Portugal were in mourning after she passed. And I spent the following 2 weeks watching videos of her performances. So Sara played a really big role in my 20s. I found her music. I will never forget the first time I saw her. I was on a flight to Venezuela, and I was only 22, I want to say at the time. I had just turned 22, and I was watching and I was like, watching the television, and suddenly this black and white video of this very, very elegant, very like uh very high vibrational. I experienced her as high, and this is before my awakening, but I could still see that high vibrational being filled the room. And I was just so enchanted by her. And and I will never forget it. But what I've been processing this last month is, what was it about her? Like, why did people so love her? And why did I love her so deeply? And I was like, was it her voice? Was it, she wasn't really much of a dancer. I mean, she danced, but like it wasn't like Beyonce. She wasn't like a Beyonce. And and what I came to realize is she was, um, I believe, very deeply embodied and very much okay with herself and with the people around her. There was a fundamental sense of, especially when she was performing, all is well. All is well. Everything is effed up, and also all is well, right? That dichotomy. So I think that's what it is to find your voice. And I think the most powerful singers are at least able to embody that when they're on stage.
Beautiful. Embodiment is a really interesting concept because
Yeah.
obviously we all have bodies already, and our
Yeah.
ancestors, especially our distant ancestors, lived in a way where they couldn't help but be very embodied. But over the last few thousand years, and maybe the last few hundred especially, we've entered a system where we do a lot of artificial forms of living, and it separates us from our body as well as all the different kinds of psychological limitations and trauma that separate us from our body. And there's a critique. The postmodern, the pluralistic consciousness becomes able to critique the modern and traditional systems. And it sees that one of the things they've been doing is forgetting the body. The postmodern critique, it seems to me, at the root is you learn to shift between perspectives, and so you discover the ones that have been left out. You're constantly realizing what's been marginalized or excluded, but you still don't quite know what to do, how to bring them back in a coherent way. So there's a history of embodiment. There's a discovery of the ability to perceive the lack of embodiment, but something else is required at more sophisticated levels or through more practice to be able to actually accomplish that or start to make it a real living tool for day-to-day life. How do you think about embodiment and levels?
Yeah, I love that question because again, there was a bit of a fiery conversation about that last night. And what comes up for me is, again, I'm going to share an anecdote. So, about 4.5 years ago, maybe 4 years ago, actually, I saw a really gifted Buddhist somatic psychotherapist. Actually, I saw two back to back. In this was in Northern California, and the second therapist that I saw, I started to realize because I had grown that this was the year about 10 months after I had gone to Esalen and I had done really deep work in in that period. And she was also a feminist. So she was a Buddhist feminist somatic psychotherapist. And I started to realize, oh my God, I can't actually say what I want to say. And there are all these places where I can no longer be met. So I would say something about the person that I was romantically involved with, and she'd be like, oh yeah, men, they're just trash. And I'd be like, and I would freeze actually. So I started to realize, oh my God, I'm dissociating a lot in the presence of this therapist. And why am I not healing, or why am I feeling so out of it when I leave? And it was because whenever I would try to push back and say, actually, I don't think that it's a men thing. I think this is a nervous system issue and it doesn't have anything to do with gender, right? Or sometimes I would try to explain my lineage, right? And that my parents were both veterans of a very gruesome guerrilla warfare. And so I was trying to encourage her to not pathologize whatever she was witnessing in me, because I was like, no, literally, there's like very recent serious war trauma in my lineage. And there were all these places in which she couldn't meet me. And so I would say the green perspective would have kind of excused away any kind of behavior that I was engaging in that was toxic, and said, oh, you just don't understand her culture, right? The postmodern would say, you are being white supremacist or patriarchal or whatever, right? They would say she's a woman of, they would say, I'm a woman of color, and how dare you, apply your white European thinking to this woman of color, right? She comes from a very different cultural context. So that isn't correct, but I was trying to support her in seeing, that's not the full picture, but I was trying to support her in seeing that. And also I would say that at the integral level, that therapist would have been able to understand what I was saying about, it's my responsibility. If my body is telling me that this is not a good relationship, then it's my responsibility to walk away. I'm not really interested in blaming him or shaming men. I'm interested in seeing all of us come into our sovereignty. And so that would have been the integral level of development. And so, yeah, did I answer your question? I feel like I answered your question, but that's kind of a sense of, there are different ways in which somatic work occurs at various levels, right? So at a healthy green stage, I think the therapist would have been able to say to me, oh, I understand that you come from a very different cultural background. And there are, like, I was looking at Suzanne Cook-Grater's models I did like a Hansi Freinock book club over the summer. And she was talking about how the lower stages are basically psychopathic, right? And I was like, oh, that makes sense. Like, I'm not going to obviously describe whole populations as being psychopathic, but that tracks for me, right? And so some of the behavior that I was describing that I saw in the community around me, um, instead of I think she would have been able to contextualize it. So it wouldn't be like excusing it away, but it would understand that there different cultures exist at different developmental stages. And also it would be and she would have had an ability to acknowledge and honor how much work I had done to come out of like deep red and blue, because they're Orthodox Christian, and a bit of orange and even some green, because my parents were both like feminists and Marxist and all of that, but she would have been able to honor the work that I had done in order to move through those stages. So I think that answers your questions. I like to give anecdotes because that's how I think about the world.
Sure. That's a good way to do it. I When I conclude an insight about the world, very often I preserve it for myself by taking a piece of my life and making a little bit of story that I repeat to myself about it so that I don't lose touch with the insight.
Yeah.
You, there's a really interesting thing about the incongruity, that moment of disjunction. Like you were talking about what it's like to be really in touch with a transcendental state of being. And
Mm-hmm.
then it affords you these odd moments where you're like, oh, I have that for sure. That's definitely going on. But how come I'm not cleaned up, or how come I'm not grown up in these ways? So that's a very strange discovery in oneself. It's also a strange discovery in someone else when you're with a teacher or a remarkable person who has other states or has the ability to communicate something of the being of the world to you, and you're sure that they have that and you can drink it in their presence, and then they
Right.
say things that sound utterly ridiculous and misguided in a lot of other areas of life. It's a very strange experience that a lot of people don't know firsthand, but when you've seen it, it's very weird and very interesting.
That I won't name names, but there's a thinker in our space whose words have impacted me, and sometimes feels very resonant. But then there's some other areas, and this is a man, particularly around gender. And I've actually noticed this with so I don't even need to name that particular individual, but a number of men in the space who seem to be very much in a state of victimhood, and pointing and the finger at women. And I'm just kind of like, how, like, what? Because if you're in a state of sovereignty, in my opinion, then again, there is an ability to honor the way that you might have been victimized, but ultimately you come back to the truth of like, how did I show up? Where were my boundaries slippery? Where did I not honor my intuition? And so you wouldn't be blaming a gender or a race or even an economic system. So I hear you. That dissonance is very profound and very real. And what's been supporting me is finding compassion, and then also sitting with the parts of myself that are also still integrating, right? So recognizing, okay, this is a little bit activating what's going on for me. And it's like, oh, it's actually just about me sinking deeper into my own experience.
The notion of sacred masculine and sacred feminine, it's
Yeah.
ancient, and it's also something that plays a role in integral thinking in a lot of higher thought communities, when you can tease the masculine and feminine apart from just male and female roles and bodies in the world. And it's tremendously useful for sense making, right? It's one of the reasons yin and yang is such a persisting idea. It's very useful to see those forms and those patterns playing out in different dimensions. But then we also have these social issues around not getting trapped in those kinds of binaries. And why are we thinking of two rather than of a multiplicity or a spectrum or something like that? How do you balance making sense with masculine and feminine and also trying to make sense with pluralities that are non-binary?
Could you tell me more? Could you elaborate on what you mean by pluralities that are non-binary?
Well, it just seems like because the masculine and feminine dynamics of the cosmos draw from
Mm-hmm.
human experience of male and female genders. But
Right.
we're socially very aware now that there might be dozens of genders or all kinds of different combinations. So when we try to think about the cosmos and see into the cosmos, sometimes that complementary two version yin yang system is really powerful. But other
Mm-hmm.
times we have to wonder whether three or seven or 12 or, you know, how how do you think about the usefulness of two and also the
Yeah.
limitations of two?
Are you trying to get me in trouble, Layman? Because this is a dicey subject and I don't want to get canceled. So, the name of the developmental psychologist escapes me right now. He's at Harvard. Anyhow, it doesn't matter. But there was a really good interview that he did on, it was a popular liminal web YouTube channel. And again, that came out of the IDW. The name escapes me right now, but they were at a merge with us a year and a half ago. Anyway, I'll pull it up later. But where he talks about gender as something that develops, gender identity as something that develops at a fairly early stage. And so I agree with him that on the one hand, it is a developmental issue, but also we can honor that. So even if it is the product of developmental trauma, like not identifying with the gender that you were born with, it's important to honor how people perceive themselves. But I also don't think that for instance, I don't refer to myself as cisgendered. I do think that biology is real. So for me, that's the integral perspective. Like the modern perspective is like, very harsh lines. The postmodern perspective is like anything goes. There are many different genders and right. And we need to respect the plurality. And then I would say, in my opinion, the integral perspective is like both and, right? So I will honor you, but I am a biological woman in that, and there are differences that come along with that. And that doesn't mean that, like, I very fully respect the rights and the bodily autonomy and the political autonomy of people who have non-binary genders. But I also, in my opinion, that's a third category from traditional male and female. And yeah, so I think there's a lot that we can learn from people who experience gender dysphoria, both like in terms of like what is the sacred masculine, what is the sacred feminine, and also that that we came here to explore and create and live fully in our human bodies. And that's beautiful. Like people who are exploring that in whatever way feels aligned for them. But also, I don't support, and this is going to sound like a conservative perspective, but I don't support what I see as like the erasure of traditional gender as well, traditional gender identities. Yeah. I answered your question, and I'm just going to acknowledge that there's a little bit of anxiety in my chest.
Yeah.
Because many of the spaces that I grew up in, that I came into adulthood in, what I just said will, I would be persona non grata moving forward. But as I said, in my opinion, growing into adulthood and coming into developmental adulthood means in part letting the chips fall where they may. And there's less politicking, and there's more trust that whoever is aligned with us or whatever is aligned with our experience will remain in our field, and whatever is not will no longer remain in our field. And that when we suppress our truth, then we don't allow people to feel into what is aligned for them. We have like false interactions, both with ourselves, we're wearing a mask, and with other people. And so this conversation and the others that I have scheduled is in part allowing myself to do that, and also hopefully other people feel permission to do the same in witnessing me do so.
Very interesting aspect. Embodiment has these different elements, right? There's one of like
Yeah.
just looking after your body, and there's one of like how do we inhabit it as identities, and there's one about how do we just feel into it as somatic beings. There's all these
Yeah.
rich elements to it.
Yeah.
I'm fascinated by this moment in history because we have an ability to change bodies now that's a little bit different than what's been happening in the past. So I mean, when I look at an individual, I'm like, okay, I see like a stack of binaries in a lot of ways. There's a genetic and
Yeah.
a chromosomal, and there's an anatomical, and there's a neurological, and there's a social. There's all of these, and then there might be more than two for some people in some parts of
Mm-hmm.
that stack, and each of the
Mm-hmm.
parts interact with each other. But when I look at somebody who's gone to that step of transforming their body in accordance with an idea or a feeling or identity, it's fascinating. It's a really neat thing to see. And
Mm-hmm.
even though we're looking at it today mostly in terms of sexual or gender identity, it's just the tip of the iceberg because we're gaining the ability to change the very nature of species now with our tools. And that means our bodies are being changed at very basic levels. And what does that do to the way we inhabit our bodies going forward?
Exactly. So again, as a somatic practitioner, and as someone who's influenced, there's a woman who does like a lot of pelvic floor embodiment work with women in particular. There are two of them, Carly Ray and Esther Zazzaro. They're both on Facebook, and I really enjoy their posts. But I actually, again, I don't know what's true of the experiences of others, but my belief, based on working with others and my understanding of my own biology, is that that could be really, really detrimental. Because any kind of surgery that we experience, any injury, all of that, our bodies, like, there's a lot of recovery work that has to happen, right? Because something that was true of us before is no longer true. And there are all these new ways that we have to learn how to manage. And so, in my opinion, that can create dissociation, and it can create more fragmentation in our psyche. And there was something else that was coming up for me. Also, I mentioned this about a little over a year ago, and actually, some people kind of distanced themselves from me, which is, again, it's fine after I said this, but I've also even come to like more conservative ideas about sexuality. So to give you more context, there are two major things, which is Robert Augustus Masters and living in the Bay Area and being around a lot of tantric and polyamorous communities. So I'm going to piss everyone off now. But but I've been around polyamorous communities for almost 2 decades, I would say, probably about like 17, 18 years. And then tantra communities for about 15 years. And over, there was just a lot of trauma and drama and a lot of really chaotic relationships. It was very rare, if ever, that I experienced or encountered people who were practicing things in a way that seemed healthy and regulated. And then I stumbled upon the work of Robert Augustus Masters about 4 years ago. And maybe 5 years ago, actually 5 years, actually perhaps longer than that. Anyway, my homie Jeff Brown was heavily inspired by John Wellwood. These are both integral thinkers, John Wellwood and Robert Augustus Masters, the former cult teacher turned somatic psychologist, cult leader turned somatic psychologist. So Robert Augustus Masters, in his book on spiritual bypassing, there are some really good sections in there. Actually, is it weird if I like break out the excerpts? Okay, one
Right.
second.
Yeah.
Okay, so it's a section in his book where he talks about releasing sex from the obligation to make us feel better. For the last 40 or so years, we've been living in a pervasively sexualized culture. The word sexy has been used to describe just about every dimension of life to an absurd extreme. While there's much more openness regarding sex than there was 50 or 60 years ago, most of that openness has more to do with breadth than depth. All too often, we are undiscerningly open, yet closed off from a truly vulnerable intimacy. While we have much more permission to experiment with sex and talk graphically about it, we rarely talk about it in real depth very often, exploring, for example, the non-sexual dynamics that might be in play during sex. For to do so would put us in a position of real vulnerability and transparency, in which we could not hang on to a semblance of having it together as easily. And then he talks about the era of so-called informed consent is centered on the myth, yes, the myth of consenting adults. In sexual circumstances, many of us may not be clearly considering what is really going on and what is at stake. Instead, making choices from a desire largely rooted in childhood to get approval, affection, connection, love, or security, or to be distracted from our suffering. At such times, we are operating not as consenting adults, but as adulterated children whose consent is but an expression of unresolved woundedness or unmet sexual needs. Then he goes on to say, spiritualized sexual practices, generally operating under the rubric of tantric, are very much in vogue, typically being taken to be good for us and even liberating, freeing us from the constraints of conventional sexuality, transporting us into zones where sex and spirituality juicily coexist, unburdened by the boundaries of everyday sex, or so we are led to believe. Those who promote tantric sex view it as a higher or more evolved form of sex, a sacred interplay, often overlooking the considerable distraction it may provide from whatever unhealthy underpinnings might be present in our sexuality. So to state that we are tantric with our sexuality confers on us the status of having outgrown conventional sexuality, achieving the status of being spiritually sexy. We used to just have sex, but now we are practicing tantra. We may still have sloppy or flaccid sexual boundaries, but now we can rationalize this by reframing it not just as openness, but as spiritual openness. So he talks about the non-sexual and pre-sexual forces that may be driving sexuality. And basically he talks about, often in Tantra, they talk about like magnetism. And he's saying that magnetism, honey, is attachment trauma, right? Like these are developmental issues. And again, I want to be really careful. I'm not speaking about everyone. I don't know every person who's in a polyamorous dynamic or who belongs to tantric communities. And I feel certain that there are many people who practice tantra and who do it in an embodied and securely attached and aware way. But in general, what I found over and over were people who had usually avoidant attachment styles, either disorganized or dismissive avoidant attachment styles, who preferred sex without obligation, and they labeled that as sexual freedom. And so as I've been doing my own somatic healing and reading the literature, I've actually started to understand these the ancient teachings present in various monotheistic traditions, and realizing, so what I think distinguishes pre-rational Christianity, because I've been re-exploring my Orthodox Christian and Jewish roots. What part of what distinguishes it is like the Christianity with which I was partially raised was very much there was a lot of shame and blame. So it was like, don't have sex before you're married. Dating is forbidden until we arrange something for you, whatever, right? All these ideas. But there was just a lot of shame. And now as an adult, I'm realizing, oh my God, so there is wisdom here, but you can't force people to get it. If you tell people they're bad because they do XYZ, then that doesn't really mean anything. But if you are able to support people in possibly coming to that realization in their bodies of like the ways that there's contractions created, like for women, contractions created in the pelvis, or a way that you become closed off from your heart and your pelvis, your pelvic floor, your vagina, whatever you want to call it, become disconnected when you when you engage in sex without really consenting to it, then that is why those teachings exist, right? Like that they were there to protect us from experiencing harm to our spirits and to our body minds. So yeah, those are some of my hopefully not too controversial takes for the integral stage today.
I like your ability to appreciate the wisdom in our inherited conformist systems.
Yeah.
There's a lot of intelligence there because they grew and evolved over a long period of time to figure out things that worked both for individuals and for individuals living as a culture together. And like you say, they kind of get perverted or dirtied by their own trauma into coming out in ways that are more shame and blame oriented, that end up mm, emotionally injuring the people they're trying to help and passing trauma into the next generation.
Yeah.
It can't, there's something interesting in there between the you can't force it element of that and
Mm-hmm.
the thing that people don't explore in tantra very well is that you can't force that either. Right? It's not really about just forcing the idea that you are liberated and indifferent to sexual anxiety and should just engage in a number of ways. It really isn't. It isn't what I hope tantra means. If the centers in the system aren't really open, which means if people aren't really communicating, if their hearts aren't really broken, if their pelvic floors aren't really open, if they're not really
Yeah.
seeing each other, if they're not actually at stake in the sexual exchange,
Yeah.
which is something that the suggestion of monogamy in the old traditions has some flaws for sure, but it does put you at stake in that situation. It asks for your commitment to be present in it, which is something that I think a lot of people who imagine they're doing tantra could learn from.
Absolutely. Absolutely. I wonder how all of this is landing for you.
Mm. There's a sort of, I mean, it's a pleasure, and there's a cheerful upswelling that looks like it goes up and around like this, like
Yeah.
a gentle fountaining, I guess.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
I think these are I think you're in and around the leading
Mhm.
edge of a lot of these topics. I
Yeah.
talk to a lot of people on these issues, so I
Yeah.
think you're doing something right.
Oh, thanks. Thanks. I appreciate it. Do you talk to a lot of people in like on the integral stage, but or do you mean just in general as you're moving through the world and attending conferences and being layman?
Both.
Yeah.
Um, yeah, I try to deal with as many different types and perspectives within the general liminal field as possible.
Yeah.
Obviously, the podcast helps a lot, and they're because you can get a broader sample of people that way.
Absolutely.
But I'm just anybody who's in any of this space is just fascinating to me, and I seem to be
Yeah.
able to like and enjoy all of them and hear the
Sweet.
shapes. I have a world of like organizational higher shapes in my mind. And when people
Uh-huh.
talk, if I can find the one that goes with what they're saying, then I
Yeah.
can learn something and maybe offer something. And everybody does it
Yeah.
in a different language, so it's a fun game
Yeah.
of moving them around.
So that especially feels resonant for me, like the upswelling. I have heard that said to me before, and it's also why a lot of the work that I'm doing is on descending because my energy tends to go up, right? So my work, and I think the work of many of us, and I won't even just say, I think maybe like 10, 20 years ago, it was like, oh, those of us in the West, but now I would say the entire planet, like a lot of us would benefit from learning how to go down, how to descend.
Yeah, I use the
Per
term premature ascent sometimes.
Yeah,
There's based on I mean, there's an old idea of a cycle of energy coming down through the centers and coming back up. And
yeah,
if you try to go up, you can
yeah,
attain some very interesting things. But if you let them all come down, then it
yeah,
will spontaneously go back up on its own, and you don't get these
yeah.
weird side effects.
Yeah. And actually, it makes me think of Saniel Bonder's book. It's called Waking Down in Mutuality. So a lot of his work, and he was like the right hand man of Adida for quite some time. But a lot of the work that he's dedicated the rest of his life to is about like waking down, right? So the descending path of spirituality.
It's a
So
great phrase, waking down. That
yeah,
book was the first thing I ever purchased on the internet.
really.
Yep. I was in 2 long car rides with Samuel this summer and got to talk to him about that a
Oh,
little bit.
lucky you. Lucky you. And also, man, you've been woke for a long time because that book has been around for a little while, right? Like at
Yep,
least,
yeah, it's quite old. I was really attentive to the Adida teachings in my early
mhm,
20s.
yeah,
And then the idea that some people were coming out of that and rethinking it was very attractive.
yeah, absolutely, absolutely. I noticed that I'm starting to feel complete with our conversation. I wonder how are things going for you, or if there's anything still really alive in the field that you want to bring into the space.
No, I'm quite happy for us to finish up for
Yeah,
now. I think this is a
yeah,
great, maybe first round of us having
yeah.
very direct conversations.
Awesome.
Happy to spend some time with you.
Likewise.
Uh, and I see, without sounding patronizing, I feel growth there. I remember seeing you
Hmm.
in Austin,
Oh yeah.
and the person I'm looking at now seems a little bit more settled, a little bit more coherent.
A lot more subtle, a lot more coherent. But I will also add that at the time I was not well. Like I was very, very, very not well. And I'm much more well now. So thanks. I appreciate that.
Pleasure getting to know you better.
Okay. I hope you have a lovely evening and weekend. Thanks everyone for tuning in and listening. Be well.